Moving on from here, we want to now go to another very important part, and given that we are in Norwich, where there's a huge agricultural community, we're going to move towards food, another huge carbon emitter. We need massive shifts in how we consume and how we farm, particularly relevant for this area of the UK, which is a large agricultural economy. At the macro scale, about how we regenerate the soil, and at the micro, about how we package and keep our food fresh in ways that doesn't create mountains of waste. Our panel host, Kevin Burch, is a journalist with 40 years' experience in the media industry, including a presenter for BBC Regional News at BBC Look East. Kevin, over to you to introduce the panel. Thank you.
It's great. I'm glad we're doing food after lunch, because I think to try and do it before lunch with rumbling stomachs would have been a disaster. But anyway, here we go. Would our panelists like to come up and take a seat? We're calling them exemplars because they are, in their own way, doing some fantastic work already at the moment. And we'll tap into their expertise and widen out the debate to look at what we can do. And as the previous speaker said, you need a long-term view, but obviously we need short-term action as well. Let me just introduce our panel. Alon is one half of a team known as Cooking Sections, who explore how and what we eat, as well as ways in which we can do so more sustainably. They use installation, performance and video, and also set up what's called Flavour, a long-term project exploring how we eat, as for instance the lines between the seasons get blurred, oceans get polluted, and the soil gets exhausted. Their work has been on show at Tate Britain and elsewhere and has proved award-winning. Alicia runs a small organic horticulture farm in West Wales with her husband Nathan. She is able to use her understanding of sustainable food from the hands-on perspective of what they produce on the farm. Alicia works as a freelance writer and content editor for the Sustainable Food Trust, writing about the issues and importance of sustainable food production and why we should all be eating real food. Carolina is R&D product lead at WNWN Food Labs, a food tech company creating a tastier, more sustainable and ethical future of food. In her role, she is responsible for the flavour profiles of products, ensuring they are delicious while making sure the ingredients, processing methods, supply chain ethics and environmental footprint are as sustainable and responsible as possible. That's your panel. Can we start with that point, Alon, probably start at the end with you, that we speak about a long-term view, but we all know time's running out, and actually what we need is short-term action. From the work you've been doing, what are the key things you've learnt that we can harness when we talk about redesigning our food systems to make them more sustainable?
So with our project Flavour, we've been working for the past 8 years to think how we adapt our foods industry basically to address the climate crisis. How are we eating according to the new seasons that are emerging, whether there are seasons of polluted seas, season of drought, season of infertile soil. And I think for us, a lot of the work that we've been doing is to try and bring together communities, groups of residents, in the case of the Isle of Skye, where we are trying to divest the whole island away from salmon farms, to generate basically alternative and agroecological food systems that in that case are based on intertidal farming of seaweeds, oysters, and also the harnessing of the waste that is being generated from restaurants on the island, basically to produce new materials, such as a tile that is made out of oyster shell that are collected from the restaurants we work with. So it's a lot about, I think, I perhaps would disagree, because I think it's always very good to disagree in these moments, about kind of, can we actually wait for our government to do something, or can we have faith in the government in this country to actually address the questions of the climate crisis? And really, because I think if you look at communities that are dealing with issues of food security, food sustainability, governments tend to fail them over and over again, and how to basically give the tools to people in two groups of residents, basically to develop alternative economies and develop alternative ways of growing food.
The example you gave, when you turned up, did they say, look out, here he comes? Or was there a kind of acceptance and a welcome that actually things needed to change? In other words, were you seen as a threat or a very positive thing?
I think that is always a combination. I think there's a community is made out of many individuals, and individuals all have their own opinion. So, of course, in the case of the west coast of Scotland, there are many people that are invested in the farming salmon industry, an industry that even though salmon, it's a fact that not many people might know, is the #1 food export of the UK. And it's an industry that has dire environmental consequences on the seas of Scotland. Yet at the same time, even though most of the industry is kind of controlled by Norwegian corporations, there are many people that make a profit in Scotland and in the UK at large out of this business. So of course there are some people that are interested to kind of keep that industry growing and being very successful, yet there are many other people that are really keen to think about alternative ways of growing. And I think for us, through various kind of methods and kind of approaches and processes that we started on the island, basically we created like a working group, right, that is kind of made out of many different people that also, I think, share very different kind of approaches and opinion, and perhaps also that was what has been the success of the project so far.
Alicia, for you, I mean, you're literally very hands-on with your organic farm and you write about it. What for you, what are the key lessons that you've learned that you've thought, yeah, we need to scale this up, this is the way to go?
I don't think, it's a matter of scaling up. I think it's a matter of relocalizing food and also changing the way that we farm in a very fundamental way. I like to call it a kind of back to the future. It's really about moving away from any kind of farming that is damaging to the environment. I'm sure there's an awareness that everybody knows that there is a deep connection, particularly in the UK, between our biodiversity loss and farming and the way that it's, Britain has been farmed in the last, 60 to 80 years. And so it's a need to really turn that around. We have a big sign that we have on one of our doors in our barns that says Ecology Now. And that's really critical. It's got to be about ecology and about a holistic approach to farming, which reaches down to the soil and up to the sky. That's how we farm. We're what I call a hyper-local business. We are really, as I said, we have relocalized where we deliver to. We cover quite, large area for West Wales, so that is relative. But I really think it's essential that we, change how we farm, and we return to practices that have been left behind as industrial farming and the Green Revolution took off.
And you don't fear that it's too late for that, because you were saying earlier, time is pressing.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, soil is remarkable in the way that when we came 15 years ago, our farm that we bought, which had a long history going back to the 1780s, had not been farmed for 30 years. And within, I would say, about 9 months, it started to be very productive. And continued on from that, and that's because of a response from the soil. Really, and we don't have great soil, but there's a lot you can do. There's a kind of, I think, attitude, and often in different parts of the UK, that you can't farm certain things in certain places. Like all the agriculture, the growing of vegetables happens in certain places. And, when we came out here in West Wales, a lot of our sort of neighbors, who were largely sheep and beef, would look at us and say, but you can't grow vegetables on this land. And, our response is, well, what did your grandparents eat? Traditionally, all Welsh farms would have grown some vegetables either for themselves, but also have sold that as well as doing sheep and beef. Yeah. So we have to remember also that the land is responsive when you care for it. And I think, there's a lot that we can turn around.
Maybe that's the biggest lesson, is don't listen to your critics. Plough on, no pun intended, but plough on regardless. Carolina, I mentioned in the introduction you're involved in research and development about flavour of food. And I mean, I'm intrigued, as I think we all were, with this chocolate you've come up with that's not chocolate. But it is chocolate, but it's not really chocolate. Could you just tell us about that and some of the other things you're doing to try and just push the boundaries a little bit in the kinds of food we're eating?
Yeah, of course. So, I mean, many people don't know this, but conventional chocolate has a really high carbon footprint and uses an enormous amount of water. So we need to come up with a solution, with an alternative to it. Of course, there's a lot of things to do to fix the supply chain, and that has to be done, and it's going to be like up to the people that are in power to do it. But what we do at WNWN Food Labs is that we use fermentation to create alternative ingredients that are more sustainable and resilient to climate shock and food security issues, and more ethical. So, I mean, my work is, it's lots of fun, especially being as a designer, as a background in design, and working in R&D in a more scientific space. It's a lot about doing ingredient research, right? And looking at what ingredients do we have around us in the UK or in our immediate area, or like Mediterranean, or from more far away. But what can we do with those ingredients that are more sustainable, that are more abundant, and which processes can we put in them, whether it's fermentation or roasting, to get a flavor development from it. And as for now, we're focusing on chocolate. So we are playing around different legumes, different cereals, and processing them with both traditional fermentation, but as well clever cooking. So food sciences, and yeah, we are mixing them together to create this ingredient. But we are not stopping in chocolate. Our idea is to continue with coffee or vanilla or other ingredients that we all love and wouldn't want to stop eating. But we need more sustainable alternatives to it.
And coffee and vanilla too, I think, are very harmful. Exactly,
yeah. And as well, because of the climate crisis, the areas in which these ingredients grow is just decreasing, right? And in the case of chocolate, the carbon footprint is due to the amount of deforestation that is happening. And there's a huge pressure in the supply chain, because we all love chocolate, we all consume it, and the demand is not decreasing, it's actually increasing, right? So this accounts to more and more deforestation and more use of child labor and slavery, etc., all the systemic issues that chocolate has. So, yeah, and this happens to a similar degree with coffee and vanilla tea as well. Yeah.
Full disclosure, Carolina did bring some chocolate samples, but they all went. So don't storm her on the way out, because she's out of supplies. I think I'm right in saying that I think the fact is that 75% of everything we grow comes from 12 plants and 5 different animals. So certainly there's scope for doing that. Alon, how do you mentioned about the island, and I mean, let's take that further. How do you take people with you? Because it strikes me what the consumers want. And let's be honest, we are living in a time when the use of food banks, for instance, is higher than ever. People talk about cheap food, whether that's right, it depends where you are, and I think it's sometimes a bit misleading. But how do you take the consumers with you in this journey? Because they may come back and say, look, I can't afford this. The prices are going to go up. How do you combat that?
Well, I mean, I think there's perhaps 2 questions folded in that. I think on the one hand, I think for our approach and the focus of our work has been a lot on the infrastructure rather than on the consumer. I think we have come to a point where walking into a supermarket today is the equivalent of walking into an ethical battleground. Am I going to choose the organic or the ethical or the fair trade or the this or the that or the other? And I think, why are we in a position in our life that we just don't go to any restaurant and any kind of corner store, supermarket, whatever it may be, knowing that everything in there is good for our body and good for the planet? And I think we have been developing a lot kind of this approach of how do we put the pressure in a way to change the system on the system itself rather on the consumers, because I think it has proven to us over and over again that yes, consumers have a lot of power, and consumers can change habits and kind of influence the market, but at the same time I think that the real power lies in the infrastructure itself. So we've been working a lot with restaurants and with museums all over the country to remove farmed salmon, for instance, and introduce climavore ingredients instead of that. And I think that kind of approaches maybe the other part of your question of like, through using these cultural infrastructures, using kind of big businesses, like big food businesses, you can really kind of educate people, and through that take them on the journey with you, rather than just saying like, oh, it's yours, it's like, you shouldn't be eating beef, no, it's like, beef should just be taken off the menu, and that's it. Yeah,
so a bit more nudge along the way. What about this? I like this whole question of food appearance as well, which Alicia, would interest you. What they call consumer aesthetics, where they don't want vegetables that don't look good. Are we changing that attitude?
Yeah, I do think that is one area that is slowly changing. But I think people are recognizing that we can't waste as much as we do, and that's hugely problematic. But I also think just to follow on from that, there's a more fundamental issue in terms of farming, and from the perspective of a small-scale agroecological farming. Why do we pay £500 a year to be Soil Association certified when a conventional farmer can do pretty much whatever they like? In terms of, how they treat their soil, what they put on it, and all that. And that's very problematic. There is an economic playing field that needs to flip, so that actually the practices that are valued are agroecological, organic, regenerative, whatever term you want to use, and that should be valued and have better, financial support than businesses that are not attending to the environment.
And can we do that? Because that feels like a big container to turn at sea, doesn't it?
It is. I won't argue with you.
And people say, at the moment, well, don't rely on the government to do this, and don't rely on big business to do this. And I was taken by what Baz said earlier, talking about his phones, when he said you've got to raise awareness, set an example, motivate industry. Perhaps that's the model we have to use here too.
Yeah, I think you're right in terms of the motivate industry, but I think it's also about ensuring that industry actually then does follow through.
Yeah.
That it's not just greenwashing, which I think is a danger.
Yeah. And Carolina, tell us about the work you do, because you mentioned in the chain you work really hard to make sure it's ethical. That must be really tough, to go right the way through with that level of detail, to know it is absolutely where you want it to be.
It's hard. But we do put the work in it, try to research our suppliers, etc. And the truth of it is that we are using like ingredients. For instance, barley is one of our key ingredients, and barley has been used in the UK for centuries for the whiskey brewing and other types of brewing. So we use these abundant ingredients that we know that have been used for centuries. Another example is we do have some carob in our chocolate, which is grown in the Mediterranean, and it's actually a byproduct from a pharmaceutical ingredient. And we are revalorizing this ingredient by consuming it and putting it on our chocolate. And it's such a great ingredient that has been used for animal feed for the last years. So we are like really giving those amazing ingredients are sustainable and resilient to climate shock, the importance that they need. It is hard, but it's also a bit about researching, and as well with the processes that we give, we're able to have certain like flavor development that we desire. So we're able to do that.
But it's interesting to see this in a global context, isn't it? Because we are here fundamentally often talking about a small farmer, a small producer in the middle of nowhere who doesn't have a massive amount of expertise, knowledge or support or equipment, who are often looking to get their yields up, so therefore they clear more areas. Often they're growing crops, but they sell the good crops onto the market, and they then eat a very poor diet. So you have to see this in a global context, don't you? Because if we don't, we're not really doing a thorough job.
No, we are. I mean, we are just starting with the research, and we're planning on scaling up. Maybe that's a challenge that we're still to see. I mean, because the market of chocolate is huge, right? And we are not saying that all chocolate is bad, because you can buy ethical source chocolate, etc. And we are not saying that we're gonna replace all conventional chocolate, because that would be very ambitious, and we would be very, very rich, by the way. But we are not doing that. We just want to, create this alternative that people can use, and with abundant ingredients. That is, so it would be better than conventional chocolate, basically.
Yeah. And how do we stand with the big players? Because you mentioned ethical chocolate. You can, in some of the big supermarkets, you can find ethical chocolate, can't you? Sometimes you have to search for it, but you can find it. Are the big players doing enough quick enough?
Well, I mean, in chocolate, they get away with a lot of it. Basically, we're talking about 60% of the market of chocolate is owned by only 6 companies. And they do get away with a lot of things. There's still like it's the same with the smartphones that we heard this morning. There's child and slaves basically working, and childs are being trafficked, etc. And I mean, in WNWN, we try to spread awareness about this. That's one of our jobs, to create a platform to talk about this. But it's all about collaboration as well, and we are very aware that impact comes with scale. So eventually we want these big players to use our product, right? So that's our goal. And I mean, we're talking a lot about consumer behavior. We want to be appealing to a certain consumer segment so that they can put pressure on the big these big companies, to say people want a chocolate alternative. So then we can collaborate with these companies.
And let's just talk about that a bit more, because collaboration is the theme of this festival. Is there a danger that all 3 of you, and this could be completely wrong, that because you kind of start off here and you're focusing on what you do you have time to look up and see what's happening with the landscape around you and look for that collaboration? Or is it a process, almost like Fairphones, of, look, let's just get this going? So there could be other players there and you could work together, but maybe you don't get a chance to look up and see what's happening.
I mean, yeah, we know that there's other players in alternative chocolate that are appearing, and we do collaborate with them. We talk to them. We know that one of us is going to succeed, and we want to help each other, right? Because we have the same mission. And as well, we, in our team, we are very interdisciplinary. So me being a designer and working in the R&D speaks by itself. So we have scientists, we have chocolatiers, we have designers, and we all complement each other, and that allows us to, have a range of areas covered. So we wake each other up, basically, because sometimes very technical people are they view very small things, while we try to talk to people, and also people in the food tech space, like people doing proteins from mycelium or alternative dairy, etc. So we try to keep it collaborative and talk to each other and help each other.
And Alicia, do you have enough people around you to wake you up?
Yeah. I was going to say one of the things that's really heartening is that there is this growing interest in what has become the buzzword, regenerative. And regenerative can mean lots of things, but in its essence, it's very positive. And a lot of farmers, for a variety of reasons, are starting to look towards regenerative practice. A lot of conventional farmers. And I think that's really important, that kind of, waking up. I was at a different conference, a little while ago, and this farmer who had been a conventional farmer for quite an extended period of time told this beautiful story of he'd been, it's end is kind of, because it was a wake-up call, but it's slightly disturbing. He was spraying heavy chemicals all over his land and out on his tractor, and he saw this hare which got caught up and remarkably survived going through the tractor and came out the other end, and then it went off and licked all the chemicals off it. And he said that moment just was it. He stopped being a conventional farmer. He stopped using chemicals. He turned around and became a regenerative farmer. And I think those kinds of experiences for farmers is transformative. And I think it seems to be something that is growing at the moment and feels hopeful.
Alon, for you, I mentioned earlier, how do we take consumers with us? Because I'm conscious of facts like a lot of young children think that potatoes grow on trees. So how, still, don't they? I know that's from the Potato Council, so we might expect that. But how do you take people on this journey where their response could be, I'm not really bothered?
That's a tricky one, I think. And my feeling is, and it is something that's actually going on in Wales at the moment and being looked at quite closely, is to go through the school system. Because a generation of adults who are raised in a certain way to eat certain things, we all have our proclivities of what we like and don't like, is one thing. But I think if you get kids when they're young and then you connect up schools with farms, and that's a really important thing that's going on in Wales at the moment, and it is being much discussed, is how do we make sure that local vegetables get into schools and that schools cook well and feed healthy meals to kids. It seems so fundamental and obvious that we should be doing that, but it's really difficult. But there are several movements in Wales at the moment where they're looking at this. How do we get school systems to stop using big, industrialized food production to, put into their school system, but to actually work with the local farmers and to buy vegetables that are closer to home. So it's difficult, and it's not going to happen overnight, but I think people are starting to think about things like that we can change that, actually.
So, Alon, again, education, key?
Yes, I would follow on that and agree. I think it's something that is really key and crucial. And yeah, it's a work that we've been doing as well, and I think on top of that, there's also culture and how to use kind of cultural spaces and cultural institutions. But I think at the end of the day, educations and schools have a very strong kind of possibility to reach a very, very large audience that is kind of crosses through society.
So if it's a theme which has come through this morning, it's going back to basics. It's what you were saying, Alicia, isn't it? It's turning the clock back and just getting back small scale, holistic, and getting back to that.
Yeah, absolutely.
And we can do that. And kids maybe are the secret to this.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I do very much feel that we can, and so also it's because I've seen it happen, and I think that connection with farms, I've had experiences of having young kids come to the farm and then taste something and realize it's not something they've ever tasted before, but it's delicious, that often happens with raspberries. But, I think those kinds of experiences are really, in terms you talk about connecting and understanding your food, farms can help with that in an immense way.
Excellent. Some questions?
Yes, certainly. So we have some really nice postings of lots of different chocolate brands online. So if anybody wants to buy some chocolate, you can. So Anonymous is back at it again today. So and asks, how can synesthesia scents and aromas help to change the conversation around food, whetting people's desire for alternatives?
Well, I guess aromas and flavors are already used a lot for the like processed foods and stuff. So there's a lot of research in that. So yeah, I mean, yeah, I wouldn't know what else to add with that. But yeah, we do work on how we can get like natural aromas from Maillard reaction and fermentation, etc. But there's like another industry that it's all about like flavorings and that they use it for making people eat more chips than they need, basically. So yeah, these things happen already.
Great. And then another question is whether organic farming is an elite class-based activity in the UK and not including other marginal, diverse immigrant communities with better knowledge of growing food organically, which links to the point that Dori was making yesterday about immigrant indigenous knowledges.
I suppose it's me again. I would say that indigenous knowledge is incredibly important. And you can go back to a whole array of cultures out of which knowledge comes. Organic is simply a kind of practice. It's also linked with, the broader one is agroecological practice. So I think that it's just another way of looking at the soil and understanding the soil and understanding how things are grown. And a lot of what fed the organic movement, and this is slightly different in the States than it is in the US, but certainly in the United States where I grew up, that really came out of the indigenous communities, both Native American and also from the slave trade. And the people who came over for that those are practices that have been long-standing, I mean, going back arguably millennia. So I think that organic has, that's been one of the things organic struggles with, is an idea of elitism. But I think when you look at the practice, actually, it doesn't have anything to do with elitism. It's something that, because it was a terminology that got used regularly to describe a certain kind of practice and then played out in, nice markets and things like that. It's kind of gotten a bit of a bad rap, I think. But it shouldn't. It's, as I said, it's about fundamental practices. And I think, what fed the organic movement was all these, indigenous practices that come from different parts of the world.
Thank you. And then two more from online, and then I welcome those from the room as well. So Camille asks, we talk about insects as the protein of the future. What's your opinion on that topic? And then another one, I'll ask just the final from online. Francis, you've already touched on affordability of better food, but could you say more, noting that industrialized food production is about more and now, and that needs to be changed?
Alon, maybe?
Yeah, I'm no expert about insects, so it will be quite hard for me to answer it in a profound way. I think what is important, kind of just to build on what was said before, that I think, all of this search for like alternative foods, alternative proteins is all great, but I think our most important kind of challenge and what we need to do is reconnect to the land and reconnect to the soil and make soil accessible and make soil something that belongs to the people and ensure that soil is cultivated in a way that has life in it. And based on that, I think everything else can build around. But I think from our perspective, it's very hard to kind of see how all of these like alternatives are going to solve the problem. All of these kind of technological fixes end up usually just perpetuating more and more problems. And yes, there's a certain necessity to go back like into the soil and kind of work from there upwards again.
Look, maybe things are changing. There's a major housing scheme in Ipswich. I noted the other 1,800 homes, and part of that is to build in allotments that go with the houses. So it's funny again, isn't it? The whole theme of, I think, what we talked about is almost turning the wheel back to go back to a time where allotments weren't actually taken away to make way for development. We see that kind of thing and that relationship with the soil as part and parcel of how we live.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think if you do that, then you're in touch with the seasons, aren't you? You understand what's happening. So, maybe there are reasons to be cheerful.
And anybody in the room want to ask a question?
Can I make a suggestion?
Yeah.
I was really struck by Alicia's comments about the Soil Association and the fact that you have to pay to prove you're operating at those standards. I'd like to recommend that they completely reverse their business model and that people who are working like that don't have to pay anything and don't have to prove it, but those that are mucking it up pay for it very heavily. So they need to become the bad soil association. And that mark goes on to all of the products in the supermarkets, which might then encourage us to look at what we're buying more closely.
There is a movement going called Clear, which they want to, they're trying to put labels, really accurate labels about what's in food. And it is gaining some momentum, but not quite there yet, I think.
Hello, really good panel, thank you very much. Just a really quick one, which is, I know it's very early days, but I wonder if you've got any thoughts on synthetic or lab-grown meat?
Well, I can start with that. I do not understand it. I think it's a bit, we're creating an alternative chocolate, but it's not comparable to ground-up meat. I've been vegetarian since I'm 16, and I don't understand it. I've never consumed it, and I think it's more a product for meat eaters. And in that sense, I do agree with Alon. I think it doesn't make sense in that sense. But also true that we all know how the carbon footprint of having a meat diet, and I think we all know that, and consumers are still buying meat. So in that sense, I think I'm more pessimistic in the sense of there's no time, basically. So yeah, I don't understand it. I think we should be eating more pulses and plant-based proteins that are available, that come from soil, and yeah.
Yeah, I can remember some years ago, one of the estates, not a million miles from here, had a huge numbers of squirrel. And so they started offering squirrel in the butchery, and it absolutely bombed. People did not like the idea of eating squirrel.
They're small and furry.
Yeah, so it's interesting. So there we had a plentiful supply, but again, it was people were like going, not for me. So it's tough, isn't it? And have you had, you mentioned the chocolate, have you had things where you think, this is a real banker, and then when you take it to the market and test it, it just comes back and it's like, ain't going to go anywhere because the market just doesn't rate it?
Yeah, I think the consumers have to be a bit ready for that. It's the same with oat milk. I'm sure many people got disappointed at the start with a plant-based milk, but now there's a segment that only drink oat milk, and not because of the fact that it doesn't come from cows, but because they prefer it. So I think there's going to be a transition, and there has to be a consumer change, basically, and people have to be open-minded, but as they are open-minded to try lab-grown meat, which I don't understand, we hope they are open-minded to try our chocolate, which it's pretty good, and people have liked it, and we've had very, very good feedback. So yeah, I'm positive in that sense.
Oh,
yeah.
That's encouraging. Good. Well, I was told I'd get stares if I overran. So just really, from each of you, what's the one thing you take away, the one reason to be cheerful that you think we can move forward with some optimism? Alon, what would it be for you, the one thing we must tackle head on?
I think the one thing from our perspective that we have to tackle head on is to really kind of make ourselves again adaptive creatures. So how to kind of shift the way we eat, the way we kind of see the seasons, the way we kind of interact with the environment.
Excellent. Alicia?
I think it's about taking care of the environment and looking at food production in relation to that, so that, because I, as a farmer, believe that we can have good, healthy food production alongside a wealth of, biodiversity. We can see that on our farm, and that's incredibly important. We cannot lose our biodiversity, It's just too much to even consider.
And Carolina?
Yeah, I would say read more about the issues with the food systems, because I think there's a lack of education around it. And as well, eat less meat, eat more pulses. That would be my personal thing. I love pulses. We should be eating them more, basically.
Fantastic. Carolina, Alicia, Alon, that's brilliant. There's so much to think about there. So thank you very much. That's excellent.
Thank you.
That was fantastic. I never realized that the there's so much of design and design thinking that actually goes into the design of things like chocolate, which I actually tried. Carolina's fantastic, the win-win chocolate. So thanks for the sample. Do find it. I know it's sold out, but do have a chance to try the chocolate. It had all these flavors that just unfolds in your mouth. I was quite surprised by it.